Hello, Metals One. In this video, I'm going to be going over the investment process for casting. So this is when I'm going to take my model and invest it in plaster in order to prepare my model for burning it out. So the first thing I need to do, here's my printed ring that I made just as a sample. So you can see I've got my sprue here, and these supports that are rendered during the printing process are still attached. So the first thing I need to do is detach them. So I'm just gonna use some little wire cutters and then also a wire file to file down those points as best as I can. Now I've got my ring. You can see where I filed away those supports right there. I may have to do a little more cleanup once this is cast in silver, but that should be easy to do. Something that I also wanted to point out, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it on camera, but something that's actually really cool about this base is that each one of your ring files, of course, has your own name. And when the 3D printer prints this base right here, it has the name of the file. So I had called this file Pretty Ring, but yeah, I just thought I'd point that out. I think it's kind of cool. All right, so before I invest this, I have to determine the weight of my model so that I'll know how much silver I'm actually going to need to cast this. So I'll just weigh this on my scale. So this weighs 2.2 grams, and I have this handy chart that I got from a workshop that I took once. It's just nice because even though the math you have to do isn't very tricky, it's just handy to have that. So this model weighs 2.2 grams, and then I'm going to be casting this in sterling silver, so I have to multiply that by the specific gravity of sterling. So that is 10.3, and then since I'm recording this on my camera, I can't use my calculator, so I have to do math in my head. So this is gonna be about 22.7 grams. So then I have to also add a little bit of extra for my button. So this is the base of the flask that I'm going to be using, and this little domed space right here is my button, and that's where I'll be attaching my ring onto by the sprue, just using some wax. So I always want to have a little bit of extra so that once this is cast, like this button shape is actually going to be cast in silver because it creates an indent in the plaster. So I always want to make sure that I have a little bit of extra. So I'm going to add just 15 grams to that. So the total weight of my model is going to be 37.7 grams. So here's my ring. This is the rubber base of my flask with the button. I'm gonna be melting some sprue wax that I've got right here to attach my sprue to the button right there. And then I'm gonna be using this alcohol lamp to do that. This is filled with denatured alcohol, and then it's just got a little wick in there that I like. I like to use this. Some people like to use soldering guns, but this is fine. So I'm just gonna melt some of that wax and drop it on here. Exciting times. Don't try this at home, kids. So I'm just building up that wax so that this is nice and attached to the button. And I'm casting my ring on its own first, just as a test to make sure, like, this castable wax resin that we 3D printed with, it works totally fine. But just because we're going to be casting all of yours, I just want to double check that our burnout cycle on the kiln is going to work fine. So I'll just sit here, let this cool off a little bit. But in a second, I'll show you, we've been working on spruing up all of your rings, and instead of having like 40 individual flasks, whenever you're doing multiples when you're casting, you want to make a little sprue tree using a bigger flask. There we go. So that's nice and attached with a bunch of different rings branching off of it. So I'll just make sure that there's no kind of gaps between where I'm attaching my sprue there. I like to just melt the wax on like this. This is also why it's kind of convenient to have made your sprue, like modeled it and attached it to your ring model. This is the sprue wax that normally I would use to just attach that on there. It's not a pain. As you can see, it's really easy. I'm already done, but it's just really convenient and just kind of cleaner to have that that sprue already attached there. All right, so this should give me a good button, and it looks like I'm making all different points of connection. I didn't even have to use my dental tools. Sometimes I'll use my dental tools to sort of melt the wax around there, but this looks good. What's going to happen in the casting process is that if we look at these beautiful pictures right here, you can imagine that this is my flask and we're looking at it from the side, and we can also see through the middle. So this is the flask itself, this is my base, and then here's my button, sprue, and ring, and they're all encased in investment. And when the investment has dried, we're going to put it in the kiln. And we'll take the rubber bottom off first, so then that just leaves the bottom of our flask and the button exposed right here. So I'll just do that. And then as the kiln starts to heat up, it's going to melt out that wax. So all the wax is going to come pouring out through here and eventually burn out. Then I'm just going to have this negative space where my wax used to be in the investment. And then once I'm ready to cast, once the burnout cycle has completed, I'll put it in the centrifuge, and then the molten silver that I'm going to put in there will fill up this entire void that's left behind from my ring. And then I'll have a silver ring, sprue, and button. And here are some of your rings that are all sprued up and ready to be invested. Now I've got my ring in the flask right there. So you can see I've got at least about a ½ inch of space from the edges of my flask. I never want my ring or model to be right up against the edge there. And then also I've got, let's see, probably 1.5 inches, but same thing, you always want to have about ½ inch or 1 inch of space from the top of your model to the top of your flask. Because if your wax model is floating all the way at the top here, you could risk, once you go to cast, the silver actually blowing through the whole mold and you won't even get a cast. So that's why it's important to note that that space is there. Now I'm just going to start investing this. So investment is plaster, so I'm just going to mix it up with powder to water as you would with plaster in the flask. And then I'm also going to be using this vacuum over here to degas the plaster, because if there are any bubbles from oxygen in the plaster, that can lead to holes or voids in the investment when I go to cast, and that could give me a weird casting or prevent my casting from even coming out. So you'll see I'm going to mix up my plaster, and then I'm going to degas it twice, once in the bowl that I'm mixing the plaster up in, and then after I've poured the plaster in here. Now I'm starting to mix this up, and I always add my investment powder to water, and I mix it up for 3 minutes straight, which is why this is sped up, so you don't have to watch me mix for 3 minutes. And I want it to have a smooth kind of pancake batter consistency. And you can see that I also taped a piece of paper around my flask. That way, if there's any extra investment, that instead of pouring over the edge, it just sort of stays in the flask. And then here, I'm starting to vacuum the investment in the bowl that I mixed it up in. So I'm gonna vacuum this for 1 minute, and we'll take a look at this. It might be kind of difficult to see just because this bell jar is a little foggy, but you can sort of see the air bubbles coming to the surface and breaking. And I'll also occasionally tap on the top of the vacuum and also the side of the bell jar to help break up those bubbles. All right, so this has been degassed for 1 minute, and then I'm going to carefully pour it into my flask there. And then, once again, vacuum my flask for 1 minute. Okay. So now that I've vacuumed this for another minute, this is all set to go, and I'll just let this sit for about 30 minutes to completely solidify. Now that the investment's set up, I put the flasks in the kiln so you can see them in here, they're all numbered. And then I turned the kiln on, so you may be able to see those lights flash on. They might not, maybe, but there they go. So the first step is to turn these knobs on to high, and then over here is where we program the kiln. So for this burnout, we're actually doing an 18-hour burnout. And then right here is a little kiln map. So whenever you're casting, you always want to make a kiln map. So this is the kiln, imagine. So this is the front and the back with our numbered flasks. And that way I can keep track of which ones we're doing first. So I have the smaller ones in the front because they're going to be less metal. So it'll take a faster amount of time for the crucible to heat up. And then when I get to these big guys in the back that have a lot more metal, the metal should melt faster as opposed to like trying to melt big chunks of metal at the beginning, if that makes sense. Obviously, this piece of paper doesn't go inside of the kiln. I had somebody ask me that once a while ago when I was casting with someone in grad school. No, the paper doesn't go inside the kiln or else it would catch on fire. So I'm just putting this right next to the kiln, so Vince and I will have it for tomorrow as a reference when we go to cast.